believe you're taking it together with 91, 92 and 109 from Deputy Broughan, Deputy Howland and Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Just so I'm clear, does this give me 4 times the amount of time I normally have?
Well, you've taken twice the amount of time you normally have anyway. So yes.
I have a long script, but that is the position, is it? Just so. Tell me when I have 30 seconds left and I'll stop. Right?
You promise?
I propose to answer questions 81, 91, 92 and 109 together. I've already set out in general terms my views on the situation in Yemen, which quite frankly is shocking. I share the Deputy's concerns about the dire security and humanitarian situation in Yemen and the urgent need to bring about a political solution for this country. There are direct threats to citizens from the ongoing fighting and credible reports of violations of basic human rights in the course of the current conflict. The UN has also warned of the imminent threat of famine on an appalling scale, with millions of people potentially at risk of starvation, as well as a significant public health risk due to the almost complete collapse of the healthcare system. The challenge of resolving this complex conflict should not be underestimated. The civil war, which has been ongoing for almost 4 years, has opened fault lines in Yemen, which will be difficult to heal. Historically, the country was divided between north and south, with the Shia being the larger portion of the population in the north, and the south being largely Sunni. The two parts of Yemen were united in one state only in 1990. The internationally recognised government of Yemen now controls less than half of the country, while the de facto authorities, usually referred to as the Houthis, control much of the north and west, where the largest concentrations of people are located, including the capital. Both parties to the conflict have the support of outside actors, with Saudi Arabia and the UAE among those supporting the internationally recognised government, while Iran is closely connected with Houthis. Rockets have been fired from Houthi-controlled areas into Saudi Arabia, including towards Saudi cities. This has been putting civilians at risk, and I firmly condemn these attacks. There are serious concerns about violations also of international humanitarian law on all sides, with indiscriminate attacks endangering civilians, unfortunately now very common. There are reports of serious human rights abuses on both sides, as well as obstacles being placed in the way of effective delivery of humanitarian aid, which we spoke about earlier. Both at UN level and in EU discussions on the issue, Ireland has sought at all times to stress that military action cannot be a solution. Rebuilding stable and inclusive government and rebuilding links between communities across Yemen will require a painstaking and long process. There are already clear challenges in restoring effective governance in those areas where the government has resumed control. This is particularly worrying in a country where Al-Qaeda has a significant presence and has had for over a decade. A ceasefire will only be a first step, but an essential one. Even prior to the conflict, Yemen suffered from serious underdevelopment, corruption and drought, and this has exacerbated the impact of 3 years of fighting on the Yemeni people. The war has had a severe impact on the economy and public services. Access to humanitarian aid is a key issue, but so too is access for commercial goods. However, there are reports that even when food and medicines are available for purchase, the devaluation of the currency and the cessation of much of the normal economic activity due to conflict means that many families have no resources or income left to buy what they need. As the UN and humanitarian agencies report, we now have an acute humanitarian situation with a cholera outbreak and a real risk of starvation for millions of Yemeni civilians. The UN humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, Lisa Grande, has warned that as many as 13 million civilians are at risk of famine if the fighting continues. At the Foreign Affairs Council, in which I participated in Brussels yesterday, EU ministers discussed the humanitarian situation in Yemen, the difficulties aid agencies face in attempting to reach those in need, and what the EU can do to help alleviate the crisis. We are particularly concerned about the recent violence in Hodeidah, which is the entry point for an estimated 70% of goods imported into Yemen. Ireland and the EU strongly supports the efforts of the UN envoy, Martin Griffiths, who is working to bring the parties together for a new round of peace talks, which may take place before the end of this month. At the request of the UN, Sweden stands ready to host such talks. The UK, which currently leads on the Yemen file in the UN Security Council, is also making efforts to bring this about, and I thank them for that. Ireland is doing what it can to address the devastating humanitarian situation and to try to help alleviate the suffering of Yemeni people. Since 2015, Ireland has provided almost €16.5 million in humanitarian assistance to Yemen. This includes a contribution of €4 million made to the UN Yemen Humanitarian Fund this year, which provides assistance in the areas of education, logistics, food security, nutrition and health. Ireland also provides humanitarian support to Yemen through our contributions to EU funds. Since the beginning of the conflict in 2015, the EU has contributed a total of €438 million to Yemen, which includes humanitarian development, stabilisation and resilience support. On the 6th of November, Commissioner Stylianides announced an additional provision of €90 million in assistance to Yemen, bringing the total this year to about €118 million.
30 seconds remaining.
Ireland is using our leverage in other multilateral fora to focus on the situation in Yemen. At the Human Rights Council in September 2017, Ireland was part of a core group of countries which ensured the establishment of a group of eminent experts on Yemen to investigate alleged violations of human rights and contravenes the international humanitarian law by all parties. Contraventions of international human law by all parties to the conflict. In September of this year, Ireland worked to ensure the extension of the mandate of that group for another year to allow the group more time to complete their valuable work. I assure the House that we will continue to support all efforts to bring an end to the violence and alleviate the humanitarian situation.
Thank you. Deputy Collins, you have an extra 30 seconds because I didn't call you at the start. My apologies.
Minister, the conflict in Yemen has taken a disproportionate toll on the civilian population. As you know, almost 4 years of war has resulted in the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The UN reports that 17.8 million people are currently categorised as food insecure, including 8.4 million who are categorised as severely food insecure, whilst the country is also suffering the worst cholera crisis in modern history. The unrelenting violence in the city port of Hudaydah has impacted on the availability of food and essential supplies, and government regulations have hampered all port commercial activities in relation to imports. We welcome and acknowledge the fact that Ireland is doing what it can to try and help alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. I note that since 2015, Ireland has provided almost €16.5 million in humanitarian assistance to Yemen. This includes a contribution of €4 million made to the UN Yemen Humanitarian Fund this year. We also note that since the beginning of the conflict in 2015, the EU has contributed a total of €438.2 million to Yemen, which includes humanitarian development and stabilisation and resilience support. There are multiple actors involved in the war, which you've said yourself, with their own agendas, and we acknowledge that efforts are being made to broker a ceasefire. Fianna Fáil fully supports the UN envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths, in his efforts to bring all sides of the conflict to the negotiating table to work on a political solution. However, let's be clear that this impending famine and the starvation being experienced by millions is man-made. In addition, the government, I believe, are withholding salaries from civil servants, including teachers and health workers in the Houthi-controlled northern part for 2 years. Most of the Yemen's population lives in the north, and state employees are a big proportion of the workforce. Starvation is being used as a weapon of war, and the international community must act urgently to unblock imports and to ensure distribution of aid. We must remember that the delivery of humanitarian assistance is a requirement under international law. If I could just ask you, by way of my supplementary, can you update us on any efforts to broker a ceasefire in Yemen? We read that Yemen's Houthi militia announced that it was halting drone and missile attacks against the country's Saudi-led military coalition and would consider a broader ceasefire. This is, of course, welcome, and I would like if you could expand on that. And finally, with your permission, Chair, given the very high risk of famine, is the Minister aware of any new plans, financial or otherwise, being considered at the EU level to protect the people of Yemen from starvation.
I
Thanks,
see
Chair.
from the note here, Deputy Wallace has requested a short supplementary. Oh, sorry, wait till I get the notes. Deputy Collins is the first. Sorry, Deputy Broughan. Short. Don't take any advantage of what.
No, I never do.
Deputy Collins
Thanks,
did.
Les Can. Yeah, just ask you, Minister. I asked you previously, I think, in September about this, and again, you expressed grave concerns, serious concerns. You tell us today it's shocking. 13 million people in danger of famine, hundreds of thousands of children, and perhaps up to 50,000 dead. I mean, is there something more proactive, though, you can do? I asked you, for example, in relation to the use of weapons by Saudi Arabia, the UAE coalition in particular. What steps could be taken in that regard? For example, I mentioned the referring of Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud to the International Criminal Court on foot of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and indeed on foot of these litany of very serious war crimes in Yemen. And I noticed, by the way, yesterday that I think Germany has issued a travel ban in relation to 18 Saudis who are suspected, and the CIA has had a report about this recently, which it directly accuses the Crown Prince of being responsible for the murder. But they've announced a travel ban on 18 Saudis in the Schengen area. Is that something that you support, Minister, in relation to bringing pressure to bear, serious pressure to bear on the Saudi authorities to stop this fighting and to bring it to an immediate end?
Supplementary.
My question is very simple. Why are you not demanding, and why is the EU not imposing sanctions on Saudi Arabia? The humanitarian catastrophe which is unfolding in Yemen is due to a very large extent to the Saudi military intervention, the blockade, and the deliberate attempts to starve the population into submission, to bomb them into submission. And of course, standing behind Saudi in that regard are the United States, France and Germany arming the Saudi regime, a regime whose agents murder a man who is a dissident journalist, dismember him, and if the reports are accurate, burn the remains of his body with acid to destroy the remains. This is what we're dealing with. There's 22 of these characters just around the corner from this building in the Saudi embassy. Why is there no sanctions? Why is this not being said? That we impose sanctions on what is an absolutely rogue, barbaric regime that is inflicting the sort of humanitarian horror that we are seeing. And of course you know the answer to this question, Minister. Because France and the UK and the United States make a lot of money backing these people, and even worse, geopolitically, they don't mind what they do. It suits them to have Saudi do this, because Saudi is a reliable ally for Western interests in the region. That's the truth. And we all know it's the truth, and millions of people are suffering. Could the Irish government not stand up and say, that's the truth, and we expect a European Union that has a bit more moral backbone to do something about it?
Deputy Wallace, supplementary.
Thanks, Paula. I don't agree with the manner in which you present this war. You described it as a Saudi and UAE backing the internationally recognised government against the Houthis backed by Iran. First of all, the internationally recognised government you talk about, Haiti was put in there in 2011 as a puppet of the US, Saudi, and unfortunately the involvement of the UN, which they have not covered themselves in glory in the area. And with regard to the opposition, the notion that this is a war against the Houthis only is rubbish. There's about 6 different groups, right? It's the people of Yemen that are on the other side, and it just so happens that the Houthis are one of the ones who garnered arms initially. And the notion that Iran is getting arms to the Houthis now is not backed up by any evidence. Nobody has come up with evidence that Iran is giving weapons to the Houthis. Iran says openly that it politically supports the Houthis. Iran tried to bring medicines and food in a civilian plane to Yemen, The Saudis, they didn't attack the plane, but they bombed the airport that they were supposed to land in to stop it from getting through. Iran have tried to bring medicines and food to the Yemen, not arms. But that's the story that's been peddled all the time. RTE can't mention the Houthis but saying the Iranian backed rebels.
To respond,
right? There's no evidence for us, Taoiseach. And this is a Saudi UAE invasion of Yemen against the people of Yemen, and they're starving them to death.
Taoiseach to respond.
Well, there's a lot of inflammatory language here, and understandably, because it's this is an issue that people have genuine concern about. I don't think it's helpful, Deputy, for you to start talking about Saudi citizens that are in an embassy here who are diplomats. The ambassador who I met last week, from my experience, is a decent person who's trying to make a coherent case in very difficult circumstances in the context of the Khashoggi murder. So I don't think it is either right or accurate to be referring to all Saudi citizens in the way that you have today. That's the first thing. Secondly, I would agree with some of what Deputy Wallace says. This is more complex than is sometimes being portrayed. There are clans and many different power sources in Yemen, and the impact of this war is devastating across those multiple clans. This is essentially bombing from the air with devastating impact, where a lot of women and children are being killed as well as soldiers, and it needs to stop. And the EU wants to use all of the influence that it has to stop it. I was there yesterday, listening to a French minister, listening to a British minister, listening to other EU ministers talk about how we can put as much pressure as possible on Saudi Arabia to stop military attacks in Yemen. So your portrayal of largely the Western world, Deputy, is driven by an ideology rather than being accurate, unfortunately. So what we have now is the prospect of talks through the work of a number of actors. The US, actually, in recent weeks has been the country looking for and demanding a ceasefire. And we need to build on that, on that positive momentum, where there is a clear signal from the Houthi side that they want a ceasefire, and where I think there is a lot of pressure on the Saudi side to facilitate real and substantive talks in Sweden before the end of the year, so that we can look to a political solution here rather than the futility and tragedy that comes from continuing military action. So I think that certainly from an Irish perspective, we will support collective EU efforts and indeed Swedish efforts to provide the basis for those talks. I think we need to plan, unfortunately, even if this ceasefire takes hold, there is going to be a significant international-led effort required to prevent a massive famine in Yemen. And that is going to cost a lot of money. And I think the EU needs to be part of that solution, both financially and from a logistical point of view. And certainly from an Irish perspective, we also want to be part of that. So our focus is very much on trying to ensure that these peace talks hold and happen, and that the humanitarian assistance that will be needed, which will be a very long and expensive and difficult process to help rebuild a country over time, both politically as well as from an infrastructure perspective and across society, is something that Ireland will be a strong positive voice on.
We move on. Yeah, but it's going to, there are very few questions done, but I'll give 30 seconds for supplementaries, but we're taking them all together. So the first, as they're tabled, Deputy Niall Collins. No. Deputy Tommy Broughan, 30 seconds.
Said Minister that you support collective, sorry?
30 seconds.
You support collective EU efforts. Now, does that include supporting the German Foreign Minister then in relation to the 18 Saudis, to the travel ban? Now, you've told me before then about the implementation of the 2014, the Arms Trade Treaty, in order to stop high-grade weapons being used in a country like Yemen. And the whole EU apparently has signed up to that. And I just wonder, how does that work out then in terms of American and British weapons and so on? Thanks, Ken.
Next, Deputy Richard by Barrett, 30 seconds.
Well, my comments weren't directed at Saudi citizens in terms of the embassy. I've simply there's 22 diplomats, which is a disproportionately high number for a small country. And given what happened in the Turkish Saudi consulate, it's just ever so slightly alarming, right? That was my point. And this is a rogue state that we've seen with the Khashoggi killing, and we're seeing in Yemen, is quite willing to engage in barbaric acts. And my point is this: the elephant in the room is that the UK, France, and the United States sell vast amount of weapons on an ongoing basis to this regime. How can that possibly be acceptable?
Can I get Deputy Wallace, do you have a short supplementary?
Thanks very much, Lawson Corda. Tánaiste, I heard you say earlier in response that Ireland buys into the UN collective decision-making process. But you accept yourself that Germany have made the decision now not to sell any more arms to the Saudis, given what's going on in Yemen. Would you not consider Ireland taking a similar role and standing up and saying that we support an embargo on all arms sales to Saudi while they're involved in Yemen? And if you're talking to the French minister and the UK, please, they are both still continuing to supply them with arms, and it's not good enough.
Tánaiste, I'll give you a minute.
I mean, on the arms sales, because we don't have an arms industry in Ireland. There are some products that are sold out of Ireland that are described as having a dual use. Although I'm not aware that we're selling any products that are used by Saudi Arabia in a military sense. But I mean, there was a discussion yesterday over lunch where a number of ministers did talk about their own country's approaches in terms of not selling arms to countries that are involved in wars while they're involved in war, and that applies to Saudi in this case. But I think the High Representative, Mrs. Mogherini, made it clear that she wasn't able to achieve consensus across the EU on an EU arms embargo because there wasn't agreement. So I mean, I think Ireland needs to focus on where it can be impactful, and that's why we've focused on humanitarian assistance. That's why we're trying to support a talks process that can lead to a lasting political solution, where hopefully Irish aid agencies and Irish funding can be part of a long and difficult process of rebuilding Yemen over time. But until there's a ceasefire first, it is impossible to be able to do that.
Can I get the next question 82, in the name of Deputy John Curran.
Tánaiste, I'd like to ask you the efforts that you and your government are making regarding the issue of the undocumented Irish in the United States, the extent to which ongoing negotiations continue to take place, and specifically the role being played by Deputy Deasy in his role as government special envoy to Congress on the undocumented.
The government continues to pursue two key objectives with regard to Irish immigration to the United States. Firstly, increased pathways for legal migration by Irish citizens to the US, and secondly, seeking some form of relief for undocumented Irish citizens currently living in the US. The Taoiseach and I continue to prioritise this issue in all our engagements with the US administration and Congress. I discussed with my government colleagues earlier this month the Ireland-EU-US relationship, and we reiterated the priority that the government attaches to Irish immigration issues involving the US. The government's special envoy to the US Congress on the undocumented, Deputy John Deasy, has been active on the issue, and our embassy in Washington, D.C. Continues to engage on an ongoing basis with the administration and with a wide range of contacts on Capitol Hill. I welcome the recent tabling of a bill in the US Congress that, if passed, would allow Ireland to avail of E3 visas and provide another very welcome pathway for Irish people to gain experience in the US. I do not underestimate, however, the significant difficulties involved in securing the passage of this bill, requiring, as it does, a 2/3 majority in the House and 60 votes in the Senate. The Government, including through the work of the Embassy and Deputy DC, will continue to engage proactively with US administration and elected representatives, both Democrat and Republican, on Irish immigration issues and specifically on this bill. The government efforts to assist the undocumented Irish in the US will also continue, as they have under previous administrations. This remains a very challenging issue, however, as immigration reform has been a very sensitive and divisive issue within the political system in the US for decades. On the welfare of the undocumented Irish, the Embassy, as well as our 6 consulates across the United States, work closely with Irish immigration centres who support the needs of Irish citizens in the US, including those who are undocumented. These centres all receive annual funding from the Government's Immigration Support Programme to support their important work.
Deputy Curran is 1 minute.
Thank you for that reply, Taoiseach. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the role the Taoiseach played in appointing Deputy DC as a special envoy. I think it was a very good thing to do. I think most of us in this House who are politicians know the importance when somebody from another country is lobbying and maintains contact with us. So I think that was very good to do. From a practical point of view, the reason I raised the issue, Taoiseach, is certainly under the current regime, the current administration in the US, there is a greater heightened awareness of the immigration issue, and people are concerned. Irish people who have been there for a long, long time, who happen to be undocumented, the families in Ireland are concerned for their welfare. And we've all known and we've seen the cases where they're not able to return to Ireland for family occasions and so forth. And while I listened to your reply in detail, I specifically want you to elaborate a further. You mentioned that you're dealing with 2 key issues, and one of the issues that's really driving it of concern is relief for the undocumented, those who are there at the moment. And I know, Taoiseach, in your reply, you're not the US administration, you can't answer. I can only hold you to account from the point of view to be assured that you and the government are doing everything possible for this particular group, which is the undocumented, and the relief that you're trying to secure for them.
1 minute to respond.
Yeah, I mean, look, Deputy, all I can say is that we want to try to get as much done as we can to both provide an avenue for Irish people who want to go to the US to do that legally. Because I think it's really important that we continue a tradition that has been there for many, many decades, whereby a continuing flow of talented, bright, motivated young Irish people can travel to the US and be part of US decision-making and US politics and all the other things that Irish people are involved in. I think that's in our interests, and I think it's in the interests of many people who want to continue to do that by choice rather than by necessity. But we also need to try to help the thousands of undocumented who are living in the US today in a far more coarse political environment when it comes to migration, and who feel a lot more vulnerable than maybe they would have in the past. But I think we also have to be realistic about what's achievable, which is why we've gone down the E3 route to actually try to find a way of introducing legislation that can actually get a result for us in the short term. And the route we've gone down is essentially the US have an arrangement and an agreement with Australia whereby E3 visas are provided for Australians coming to the US. There's a quota each year provided. That quota is not used in full in many cases. And so what we are hoping to be able to do is to use visas that would otherwise not be used. In fact, visas that are shown not to be used because it'll be the following year that they could be potentially available for the use by Irish people who want to travel to the US. So, I have been on Capitol Hill with Deputy DC. We've met people like Paul Ryan, Nancy Pelosi, Richie Neal, many others from both parties to try and find a way of getting this done in a sensible way.
Deputy Curran, second supplementary.
Thank you very much, Tánaiste, and I appreciate your response. A significant element of the response is, I suppose, to people who want to travel in the future, to new visas and so forth. I just want to reflect on a comment you made previously. About 6 months ago, you said the government has been exploring a number of different options, including the possibility of a reciprocal agreement covering the undocumented Irish in the US on the one hand, and US citizens looking to move to Ireland on the other hand. I suppose the question I'd ask you specifically, have you made any progress on that element in particular? So I'm clear what you're saying in relation to people looking for new opportunities, but the focus of my question are those who are in the US at the moment, those who are classed as undocumented, who are living in limbo effectively. Has this reciprocal arrangement made any progress since you made that comment previously?
Yeah, in relation to the legislation that's currently being proposed, there is a reciprocal arrangement in return for that. So that US citizens who want to come to Ireland, or US citizens who want to retire in Ireland, and there are many who would like to, would be facilitated in doing that in a more streamlined way than is currently available. It's currently possible to do it, but we could improve the conditions under which that happens. So I can assure you, Deputy, that we continue to explore ways in which we can help both undocumented, but also to try to ensure that there is a visa system available. I mean, there is nothing available at the moment, except for students for the summer. So we are trying to ensure, let's take this one step at a time and try to deal with what's possible in the short term and not lose sight of obviously the other priorities that we have as well, where we constantly look for avenues and opportunities to try to make progress on the undocumented.
Deputy Sean Crowe, 30 seconds to introduce. And it looks as if this could be the last. We have only 8 minutes left.
Okay. I raised the fact that a far-right fascist is now President-elect of Brazil in a written PQ on the 6th of November. Bolsonaro's campaign was based on fear, division, racism, sexism and homophobia. He posed a major threat to human rights protections, indigenous communities, and as this PQ outlines, the environment. You refuse to condemn his far-right policies or even state your concern in response to my written PQ. Perhaps you will, might in your answer, do that now. Thank you.
Mr. Bolsonaro was elected as President of Brazil on the 28th of October 2018 and will be inaugurated on the 1st of January next year. Officials in my department in Dublin, at our embassy in Brasilia and at our Consulate General in São Paulo followed the election process very closely and have continued to monitor political developments since, including proposals the incoming government is considering once it takes office next year. It's important to note that the full plan for the new government will not be clear until after the President-elect assumes office on the 1st of January. The President-elect has stated that some final decisions on government policy and structure of individual ministries, including those to which the Deputy refers, will not be made until he is in office. He has already indicated that he no longer wishes, for example, to merge the agriculture and environmental ministries, which I think has reassured a lot of people. I'm aware of the difficult situation that currently exists for many environmental and land rights activists in Brazil and across Latin America. My department continues to monitor this issue closely. I wholeheartedly condemn any acts of violence or intimidation against peaceful activists or civil society actors. I call on all relevant stakeholders to respect these groups' rights, to engage in free and open civil society, in a free and open civil society space, which is an essential part of a functioning democracy. Officials at our embassy in Brasilia and our Consulate General in São Paulo and our offices in Dublin engage regularly with civil society groups and with human rights defenders that are present on the ground in Brazil, including environmental and land rights groups. Ireland will continue to monitor developments closely, as well as continuing to engage with EU and local partners and raising these issues at an EU and a UN level as appropriate. But Deputy, I don't think there's anything to be said anything to be gained for Ireland by slagging off someone before they even take office. So He was democratically elected. Of course, if decisions are taken in Brazil that we have a fundamental difficulty with, I won't be shy to be vocal about that.
For supplementary.
But he's not even president yet.
For supplementary.
As I'm concerned about that, I see his election as a clear threat to democracy in Brazil. He was a captain in the military during their brutal big dictatorship, and he said their only crime was that they didn't kill enough people. He's called on the indigenous communities parasites, called for tens of thousands of his opponents to be arrested, called for the police to extrajudicially kill more people, and told a famous senator for promoting human rights that she was too ugly to be raped. That's the type of individual that we're talking about. But yes, Ireland would, and you would suggest that you remain silent and have no comment yet on any of these actions. Last week, the Oireachtas Foreign Affairs Committee heard from an NGO from Brazil, and she detailed the extreme threat and fear that he has created in the country. Your written reply to me said that Ireland looks forward to maintaining our strong relationship with Brazil in the future and will continue to efforts to advance our interests and values in our engagement with the new government. Is any of that based on human rights due diligence? Last November you launched the National Plan on Business and Human Rights, but there was no mention of human rights in your reply to me, on your written reply. So I'm concerned in relation to where this is going.
Supplementary.
Deputy, with respect, this seems to be a Sinn Féin approach. You judge people by the individuals concerned. You don't. No, sorry. We will judge people by what they do. He's not the president of Brazil yet. Our job, as the Department of Foreign Affairs, is to have appropriate relations with countries around the world. And I don't write off our entire relationship with Brazil because we disagree with. And clearly, I do disagree with much of what he has said. But he is the president-elect that has been democratically elected. We will judge him on the decisions that he makes once he is the president. And our job is to look out for Ireland's value system and our interests. This is a very, very large country in South America. It's one of the world's superpowers in many ways. And so Ireland will reach out and try and work with people even if we disagree with them. The Sinn Féin approach is to just shut people off if they don't agree with your perspective. And so, we try to win the argument with these people rather than actually write them off before they take office.
Final question, and that'll conclude.
I suppose you might have a different approach to dealing with fascism than I have, and it's not a case of Sinn Féin's approach to not to deal with people. But I'm glad you say you don't agree with some of his policies, because I think his policies of what he said in the run-up to that election was appalling, and anyone in their right mind would actually say what you're saying is wrong. And the idea that a person who is running for public office is asking for extrajudicial killing, is talking about is homophobic, racist, sowing fear and division, and talking that more people needed to be killed during the military junta. How could anyone have any empathy with a president-elect like that? So yes, Ireland is concerned about its exports and so on, but Taoiseach is. Well, that's the subtext in relation to what you were saying. We don't say anything, but we say it about some countries, but we're not saying about Brazil.
There'll be a minute to respond. This is the final night.
Deputy, I haven't expressed any support for this particular individual. But I mean, for you to stand up here and start talking about people's pasts, and then and then their role now in politics is a bit rich, quite frankly, from your own party, right? I don't. This party.
Deputy Crowe, no. Deputy Crowe, no interruptions.
I will develop it.
No interruptions.
I will develop it if you want me to. Well, sit down and let me develop it.
And Taoiseach without interruption. Please, Deputy Crowe, and Taoiseach without interruption.
Deputy, my job as a Minister for Foreign Affairs is to uphold Irish values, to look for Irish interests in terms of the relationships that we have abroad. Yes, there is of course concern in relation to the direction that politics has taken in Brazil. Absolutely. But we will have to work with the new president. We'll have to build a relationship with that government. We will be critical of him or any other world leader if it's appropriate to do so. And that's what we try to do through UN structures, through EU structures, to support multilateralism, to support a rules-based order, to make sure that human rights organisations and NGOs are protected where possible. And I think our actions have been pretty consistent in that regard. But whether we like it or not, we have a new president-elect in Brazil. We have to judge that person on how they perform as president when they take office on the 1st of January, and we'll do that without fear or favour.